We are here to help you. What is your name?
Welcome to episode 18 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two films to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors of the haunted house, which is very different to the horrors of the old dark house that we discussed back in episode 12. First up, we have The Uninvited from 1944, directed by Lewis Allen and starring Ray Milland, Gail Russell, Ruth Hussey and Donald Crisp. Then we jump forward in time to 1980 with The Changeling, directed by Peter Medak and starring George C. Scott, Trish Vandeveer and Melvin Douglas. Both of this week's films are classic haunted house stories, filled with many of the familiar tropes of the subgenre, including locked rooms, revealing seances and dark family histories. But they're also examples of the ghost story as detective mystery, where the investigation of the present-day haunting gradually uncovers the hidden crimes of the past, revealing the truth to the audience at the same time as the protagonists. It's also fair to say that they are both very much prestige productions, bringing a seriousness to the genre that is reflected through their storylines, cinematography, and the casting of Academy Award-winning and nominated actors. Along the way, we'll be discussing Hollywood's rather strange early reluctance to depict ghosts in horror movies, the career of Ray Milland, the tragedy of actress Gail Russell, the somewhat dubious true story behind the movie The Changeling, and much more. Before we do that though, as always, I would like to mention the main references that I've used for this week's episode, which of course will also all be listed in the show notes. When discussing The Uninvited, I have referred to extras and commentary on the Criterion Collection Blu-ray release of the film, and an interview with the director Lewis Allen that was included in the accompanying booklet. I've also referred to an essay on the Criterion Collection website entitled Spirits by Starlight, the In Memoriam page for Gail Russell from the LA Daily Mirror, and IMDb and Wikipedia entries for the film, Gail Russell and Ray Milland. And when discussing The Changeling, I have referred to extras and the director's commentary on the Second Sight Pictures Blu-ray release of the film, an article on the Cheeseman Park haunting from the Denver Public Library archives, IMDb and Wikipedia entries for the film, George C. Scott and Melvin Douglas, and an article by Sam Ewan titled The Horror Classic That Ushered in a New Era in BC Filmmaking, and that's on the website montecristomagazine.com. Regular listeners will know that very often at this point in the episode, I talk about the history of whatever subgenre we are discussing, leading up to the first film of the week. But for The Uninvited, it's impossible to do that, as strangely enough, this 1944 movie was very much the first time that Hollywood actually depicted a haunting in a serious fashion, which feels surprisingly late given the Universal Studios horror boom of the early 1930s. So I guess the question is, why did it take so long? Up to this point, Hollywood haunted house movies were usually built around the trope of the old dark house that we discussed back in episode 12, when we talked about the movie The Cat and the Canary. Beginning with The Bat in 1926, these films, and the plays on which they were based, generally depicted the supernatural as a Scooby-Doo-esque cover for criminal goings-on, and the horror elements were very much red herrings, as opposed to being the actual point of the film. When the Universal horror boom began in 1931, it focused much more on classic monsters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Mummy, Paramount Pictures did make a vague attempt to pull off a ghost story in 1933 with the film Supernatural, starring Carole Lombard. In this movie, which has been described by Kim Newman as a fascinating mix of the bizarre and the conventional, Lombard is possessed by the spirit of a dead murderess. However, it was not a great success, and that possibly discouraged any further interest in spiritualism from the Hollywood studios. A year later, the Hays Production Code started to be enforced, and whilst it didn't ban ghosts as a subject matter, it did insist that religion was handled respectfully, and that films should not promote wrong beliefs or ridicule faith. Studios probably felt more comfortable erring on the side of caution and avoiding stories that depicted spiritualism as a serious subject, and rational explanations for hauntings and mysterious goings-on were probably a much safer bet. Exceptions to this would be comedic films like Topper from 1937, in which fun-loving ghostly couple Cary Grant and Constance Bennett haunt a stuck-in-his-ways bank manager friend in an attempt to get into heaven. There was also Abbott and Costello in Hold That Ghost in 1941, or I Married a Witch in 1942, where Veronica Lake plays the spirit of a 300-year-old witch who falls in love with a politician and who then magically rigs an election. The first horror boom faded away in 1936, and when the second wave began in 1939, the safe bet for the studios were their brand-named monsters, mad scientists, and horror comedies. As we know, over at RKO Studios, Val Lewton was experimenting with subtle and psychological horrors, and while he may have released a movie called The Ghost Ship in 1943, the title is a metaphor, and there are no ghosts depicted. That being said, it's an incredibly good film, and I would highly recommend watching it if you ever get the chance. However, there were some signs of the ghostly on the horizon, mainly due to the success of Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca in 1940, which again has no literal ghost, but certainly has the right atmosphere, with its stately home of Manderley very much haunted by the spirit of the titular character. The box office, critical reception, and Academy Awards that followed certainly made the notion of gothic romance very appealing to the studios. So it's not surprising that when they finally got around to delivering a haunted house movie, as a gothic romance was exactly how it was marketed. All of which brings us to our first film of the week, which is The Uninvited from 1944, directed by Lewis Allen and starring Ray Milland, Gail Russell, Ruth Hussey, and Donald Crisp. This was based on a novel by an Irish writer and political activist called Dorothy McArdle, and it was adapted by Frank Partos and Dodie Smith, who was the creator of 101 Dalmatians. And now we are getting into the spoilers for the movie, so if you haven't seen The Uninvited yet, proceed with caution. The film tells the story of Rick and Pamela Fitzgerald, a brother and sister played by Ray Milland and Ruth Hussey, who fall in love with an empty house that is quite literally perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea. The house is owned by Commander Beach, played by Oscar-winning actor Donald Crisp, who lives nearby with his granddaughter Stella. The previous residents were his daughter Mary, her artist husband, their daughter Stella, and an artist model called Carmel, with whom he was having an affair. Stella has been raised by her grandfather ever since her mother died on the cliffs many years earlier, and is deeply attached to the property. The idea of the house being sold upsets her greatly. Nevertheless, Commander Beach sells it to Rick and Pamela for an unusually low price. Shortly after moving in, they start to experience strange occurrences, including hearing a woman sobbing in the night, flowers wilting in a matter of seconds, strange cold spots around the house, and mysterious lights and mists. And all of these seem to be connected to Stella, whose increasing visits to the house both annoy and frighten her grandfather. As the film continues, we begin to learn the secrets of the property, and of the tragedies of the past that are endangering the present. So, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the original novel was written by Dorothy McArdle, who was a prominent Irish political activist, historian and journalist, as well as being an author. The novel was originally published in the UK in 1941, under the title Uneasy Freehold, and then was released in the US a year later in 1942 under the title The Uninvited. This was her first fictional novel and was a wartime bestseller, which was widely praised for its slow burn suspense and its intricate psychological ghost story. And while the film is widely acknowledged as being faithful in spirit to its source material, the screenwriters did streamline the narrative of the film, as well as removing or transforming some secondary characters altogether. I've not read the original novel myself, but modern reviews and analysis have suggested that the source material is far deeper than the screen version, being decidedly political and feminist, which is not surprising given McArdle's backstory. She was born in 1889 in County Louth into a wealthy brewing family and was educated in Dublin, where she studied English and history at university. She was deeply engaged in the Irish nationalist cause and became very active in the struggle for independence, joining the Irish Nationalist Women's Association and working as a journalist and propagandist in the 1920s. This, however, led to her imprisonment during the Irish Civil War, an experience which left a lasting mark on her writing. In 1937, she published The Irish Republic, a factual history which remains one of the most important pro-Republican accounts of the revolutionary period. And in 1941, she published Uneasy Freehold. This was written as a reaction to the limiting view of women's roles within the 1937 Irish Constitution, of which McArdle was a fervent critic. In the novel, the character of Mary Meredith represents the mythologization of motherhood, while the character of Pamela is given far greater depth in the original story, as well as a backstory in which she has nursed her dying father for years, adding a commentary about gender roles that is absent from the movie. Interestingly, the character of Miss Holloway, who is incredibly menacing in the film, is also, by all accounts, relegated to an incredibly minor role in the novel, and is there only for exposition purposes. There are other changes too, though somewhat less significant. The house in the movie is set in Cornwall, whereas in the novel it is in Devon, and Rick in the novel is a drama critic and wannabe playwright, whereas in the movie, and as played by Ray Milland, he's an aspiring composer. This, of course, immediately makes Rick a more sensitive figure and allows him to sit tinkering at the piano, which is far more filmic than watching somebody writing, and which is also something that we will see in our second film of the week, The Changeling. This also allows for romantic composition of a song for the heroine Stella, which becomes a romantic and spectral motif throughout the story. And also, if we're being cynical, was possibly also inserted for financial viability. The song, titled Stella by Starlight, went on to become a jazz standard when it was given lyrics in 1946, and it went on to be recorded by artists as diverse as Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Charlie Parker, Chet Baker, Nat King Cole, and Miles Davis. The subject of the composition, Stella, is played in the movie by the actress Gail Russell, and The Uninvited is seen as her feature debut, though in reality she had already appeared in 2 movies by the time of the film's release. It was, however, her first starring role, and the real beginning of a career in which she was, sadly, never truly comfortable. A very reluctant movie star who was pushed into performing by her mother, her fear that we see on screen is not so much acting as a real reaction to being put in front of the camera, something that would sadly lead to a very early dependency on alcohol. She was born in Chicago in 1924, but her family moved to Southern California when she was a child, and this is where she grew up. A painfully shy and insecure teenager, she had absolutely no desire at all to be an actor, and instead wanted to become a commercial artist. The story of her discovery by Paramount Pictures is possibly apocryphal and designed to build a Hollywood legend, but it is said that Paramount's talent chief, William Meiklejohn, offered 2 high schoolers a lift, and in the car they could not stop talking about one of their classmates and her beauty, which had seen her dubbed as the Hedy Lamarr of Santa Monica High. Tracking her down, Meiklejohn immediately signed her to work in movies, and she made her debut at the age of 19 in the 1943 movie Henry Aldrich Gets Glamour. Russell, who was undoubtedly exquisitely beautiful, had a slightly different recollection, saying in later interviews that her mother, Gladys, practically dragged her in to see Paramount's talent chief, and that she was completely petrified. She also added that at the time the family were in such dire financial straits that she was sleeping on the living room floor on a pile of newspapers, and that when Paramount offered her $50 a week to go onto contract, her mother said, "Take it, we need the money." Her mother clearly had an incredibly domineering role in her career, and there has been much speculation, admittedly somewhat lacking in evidence, that she was very much a stage mother, projecting her own failed dreams of stardom onto her daughter. But whatever her motivations, they would tragically lead to her daughter's downfall. Regardless of the financial rewards, Russell was never comfortable in front of the camera, with nerves and insecurities reducing her to tears on more than one occasion. And this would, of course, frustrate other cast members and the crew, and that in turn would just further feed into her insecurities. Director Lewis Allen was certainly not enthusiastic about casting her in The Uninvited, saying that when she read for the part, it was, quote, pretty bad. However, as she was under contract at the studio, and he was a first-time director, he had little choice but to cast her. It is reported that she was so nervous on set that she could barely get through a line without bursting into tears, and it was only the patience and kindness of Ray Milland which saved her, as he would patiently and compassionately work with her on the scenes between takes. The actor Donald Crisp, who plays her grandfather, was not quite so sympathetic, and director Lewis Allen recalled, quote, "The only person who was unkind to her was Donald Crisp. He thought it was sort of amateur night working with this unknown actress. You see, Donald Crisp was very much a professional, and he didn't agree with all this motion picture business of bringing young people in and giving them a break. He thought they should only employ pros. He was just brisk with her, that's all." End quote. Sadly, it was reportedly on The Uninvited that Russell would be given some quote-unquote advice that would be her undoing, when the head of makeup suggested that she drink alcohol in order to calm her nerves. Russell, who had never consumed alcohol before, soon became increasingly dependent and would eventually become an alcoholic. The press tour for The Uninvited when it was released didn't help, with Russell reportedly starting off weighing 125 pounds and then by the end of the 2-month tour weighing only 105. Everything, she said, was far too rush. The success of The Uninvited did lead directly to a run of high-profile movies. However, her nerves and discomfort never improved, resulting in an on-set nervous tic of clasping and wringing her hands, and this became so severe that one director literally tied her hands to her side with handkerchiefs. Her dependence on alcohol became more serious, and there was a very public unravelling in the 1950s, including being arrested on a drunk driving charge in LA in November 1953, and most notoriously driving her convertible into a coffee shop on Beverly Boulevard in the early hours of the 4th of July 1957. This incident quite naturally upset her greatly and did little to help her mental state, addiction issues, or her career. Tragically, she died in Los Angeles on the 26th of August 1961, aged just 36 years old. Early reports described multiple empty alcohol bottles in her apartment, and her death was attributed to liver disease associated with acute and chronic alcoholism. Sadly, the tragedy of Russell's life, which was likely facilitated by her own mother, makes the character and the central premise of The Uninvited all the more tragic in retrospect. As the movie progresses, Stella is committed to a sanatorium by her grandfather, who believes he is doing so to ensure her own safety. Sadly, he has chosen a sanatorium run by Miss Holloway, who in the film version comes across very much as a Mrs. Danvers-style character as seen in Hitchcock's Rebecca, completely obsessed with the dead Mary Meredith, even going so far as to name her sanatorium after her. Much has been made of the dynamic between Miss Holloway and the late Mary, particularly given Miss Holloway's intimidating, chic and cool presence, costumed by the legendary Edith Head. More than one retrospective viewer has seen this as queer coding, and there's certainly good reason to think so, given that Miss Holloway describes the late Mary as, quote, a goddess. Her skin was radiant, and that bright, bright hair. The nights we sat by that fireplace planning our whole lives. And it wasn't flirtations and dresses we were talking about. We were no silly, giggling girls. We intended to conquer life. End quote. The film has certainly garnered a large following in the LGBTQ community because of this dynamic and subtext, and this was also reportedly the case back when the film was released in 1944. The film scholar Rona J. Berenstein quotes a letter written in 1944 by a member of the Catholic Legion of Decency, which was written to Will Hays, who was Hollywood's head censor and the man after whom the Hays Code was named. Quote, in certain theatres, large audiences of questionable type attended this film at unusual hours, drawn by certain erotic and esoteric elements in the film. End quote. Berenstein goes on to say that the letter was ultimately a very stern rebuke to never let this kind of thing happen again. But, of course, as we discussed last week, and for films at the time, what this also means is villainy and mental decay, which is evidenced by Miss Holloway going completely mad and revealing that Mary Meredith was not the warm maternal presence that Stella believed her to be. We now discover that Stella is in fact the daughter of the artist model Carmel, and that Mary Meredith died when she attempted to throw the baby Stella from the cliff on which the house stands. This rather bleak family secret gives a rather sharp twist to the plot, as the spirit of Carmel, who the audience have been misled to believe is evil, turns out to have been the force that has been trying to protect Stella all along. The reason that Stella is still drawn to the house is that the spirit of Mary Meredith, who the girl has mistaken for an angelic and caring mother figure, only wants her around so that she can finish off the job. And incidentally, the spirit figure Mary, who appears as a shimmering figure on the staircase and hovering in the doorway, was achieved through double exposure and superimposition, filming an actress against a dark background and then combining that image with a live action shot. These effects were helped enormously through the work of cinematographer Charles B. Lang, who would go on to be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Cinematography for his work on the film. Lang uses the fact that Wynwood House has no electricity to build mood, lighting the interiors with candles, oil lamps and flashlights. The house is full of shadows and darkness, most obviously when Rick and Pamela are listening to the ghost crying in the night, or the candlelit seance scene that sets the tone for innumerable seances in movies ever afterwards. But there are also less obvious moments too, such as the flickering of light reflected from the sea that dances over the ceilings, or the Stella by Starlight scene in Rick's studio. Rick is played by Ray Milland, an actor originally from Cardiff, who would just 1 year later go on to win the Best Actor Oscar for his performance as an alcoholic in the movie The Lost Weekend. He was born Reginald Truscott Jones in January 1907 and spent much of his childhood living with extended family after his parents separated. He served in the Household Cavalry of the British Army and became a proficient marksman, horseman and airplane pilot. He left the army to pursue acting, first as an extra in British films, and then appearing in the movie The Flying Scotsman in 1929. This led to interest from Hollywood, and he moved to the US in 1930 and very quickly became a leading man. International stardom followed in the 1930s and the 1940s. As I just mentioned, he won the Best Actor Oscar for The Lost Weekend in 1945, but he also starred in the Fritz Lang thriller Ministry of Fear, the film noir The Big Clock in 1948, and Alfred Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder in 1954, to name just a few. Horror fans will have seen him in several genre movies, including the Roger Corman Edgar Allan Poe adaptation The Premature Burial in 1962, And I have to say that film scared the absolute bejesus out of me as a kid, mainly because of the menacing gravedigger whistling Molly Malone. Milland was also in another Roger Corman movie in 1963 when he starred in X, The Man with X-Ray Eyes. In this, he plays Dr. James Xavier, the X of the title, who invents eye drops that are intended to increase the range of human perception. Perhaps unwisely using himself as a guinea pig, he discovers they allow him to see far too much, including perhaps something monstrous watching from the edge of the universe. The ending of the film is particularly nasty, so spoiler alert if you ever want to see it. The film ends with Milland taking the advice of a preacher far too literally and plucking out his own eyes. Though, according to Stephen King in his book Danse Macabre, there may be even more. As he says, quote, "I have heard rumours, they may or may not be true, that the final line of dialogue was cut from the film as too horrifying. If true, it was the only possible capper for what had already happened. According to the rumour, Milland screams, 'I can still see.'" End quote. He also starred in and directed the movie Panic in the Year Zero in 1962. This is a post-apocalyptic and low-budget thriller and follows a Los Angeles family on a camping trip when nuclear war suddenly breaks out. Cut off from civilization, the father, played by Milland, becomes increasingly ruthless in his efforts to protect his wife and children, falling into violence, looting, and paranoia as social order collapses. It's an incredibly stark and harsh movie, reflecting the anxieties of its time, and also, if we're honest, probably the anxieties of today, and it's definitely worth a watch if you get the chance. Other genre movies are admittedly of a slightly more mixed quality. In 1972, he starred alongside a very young Sam Elliott in the eco-horror Frogs, and played the head of a very nasty capitalist family who pay for their sinful lives by being overcome and devoured by the local wildlife. He also starred in the exploitation movie The Thing with Two Heads, also in 1972, but the less said about that one the better, in my opinion. There was also an appearance in the substandard anthology movie The Uncanny in 1977, and those of us of a certain age may also remember him as an ominous villain in the 1975 children's movie Escape to Witch Mountain. Shallow fans will also see him in the 1977 film The Pajama Girl Case. Milland himself said that The Lost Weekend was the only role that he was ever really proud of. In his memoir, Wide-Eyed Babylon, which was published in 1974, he admitted that he really wasn't confident about taking the role, worried that he would look amateur, and saying that for the first time he was required to actually act. And indeed, he gave a performance that won him not only the Academy Award, but also the Grand Prix at Cannes, and it also cemented his legacy as an actor. However, years later, when he was starring in a detective series called Markham on CBS, he gave an incredibly candid interview, saying, quote, "I have never liked acting, I don't enjoy it, and I don't like the profession. I never have. Standing in front of a crew playing love scenes embarrasses me. I'm self-conscious as hell. It's never been pleasant. It's a job just like any other job. Sometimes you like it, and sometimes you don't." End quote. Ray Milland passed away in March 1986 in California from lung cancer. He left behind a legacy of over 100 movies and countless TV shows, and he has gone down in Hollywood history as one of the most versatile leading men of his generation. In the role of Rick, he displays a natural screen presence and a great chemistry with both Gail Russell and Ruth Hussey, and he also has a huge amount of old-school leading man charm, which is probably why he is able to so easily exorcise the malevolent ghost of Mary at the end of the movie, simply by getting a bit cross and throwing a candlestick at her. To be honest, this is possibly the weakest part of the movie, and after all of the build-up, it seems a bit of a letdown, to say the very least. Given that the film pretty much set the tropes of the candlelit seance, spiritual possession, and also contains the quite extraordinary sequence where a fresh bunch of flowers withers in a matter of seconds, one might have expected a little bit more from the climax. I guess that the Welsh charm from the valleys is just too much, even for a malevolent and psychopathic phantom. Joining Milland and Russell is Ruth Hussey, who plays Pamela Fitzgerald. Hussey, who was Oscar nominated for Best Supporting Actress for her performance in the 1940 movie The Philadelphia Story, is very good in the role, even though the part is greatly underwritten. I've already mentioned that the character of Pamela had a much deeper backstory in the original novel, but she also had a significant supernatural encounter that was also changed for the film. During the seance sequence in the movie, it is Stella who becomes possessed by the spirit of Carmel and begins speaking in Spanish, whereas in the original novel, the possession happens to Pamela. And incidentally, the Spanish that is spoken during this scene is another clue to the secrets of the past, and translates to listen, listen, it's not her, do not believe anything. Donald Crisp, as the Colonel, gives a convincingly stern performance, though if the earlier anecdote is to be believed, this may have been less a performance and more a representation of his real personality. And Cornelia Otis Skinner, better known as a playwright, monologuist and author, delivers a suitably hieratic performance as Miss Holloway. But a special mention should also go to Alan Napier, who appears here as Dr. Scott. Like Pamela, he is a character whose importance has been pared back from the novel, but while his role here is relatively modest, he would go on to achieve far greater recognition on television as Alfred the Butler in the Adam West Batman series. On its release in 1944, The Uninvited met with a strong positive reception, with critics calling it a most intelligent thriller, cold shiver melodrama at its best, and easily one of the best mystery movies of recent months. It is interesting, of course, given what we know about the history of this film, that many critics referred to it as a mystery thriller, and indeed many were surprised to find out that the film's ghost turned out to be real, with one critic saying that, quote, the phantoms in an ordinary motion picture of this sort would automatically turn out to be somebody's cat, or an envious neighbour attempting to devaluate a vacant house. End quote. At the same time, probably adding to this surprise, was the way that the film was marketed, which, following the success of Rebecca 4 years earlier, focused much more on the gothic romance as opposed to scares, with the film described as the story of a love that is out of this world. Whatever that means. Clearly, the studio marketing department was uncomfortable promoting the supernatural, which is rather understandable, given that the monthly film bulletin said, quote, it remains a question, however, whether such a film should ever be made, producing visual evidence of unexplained occult phenomena, which, to say the least, have never yet been photographed. End quote. I am also very happy to say that despite her nerves and on-set terrors, Gail Russell was specially singled out for praise by the critics, who called her a revelation among newcomers and stated that the picture belonged to her. She would go on to work with Alan again on his next film, a murder mystery called The Unseen, and that can currently be found on YouTube. It's not as good as The Uninvited, in my opinion, but it has its moments. But despite the success of The Uninvited, the major studios in Hollywood were still not falling over themselves to produce haunted house movies, and this would last for many more years. Despite the occasional and generally low-budget attempt like William Castle's The House on Haunted Hill, it really wouldn't be until the 1960s, with the release of movies like The Innocents in 1961 and of course The Haunting in 1963, that the haunted house would become a real staple of mainstream horror cinema. These films were then followed by others like The Legend of Hell House in 1973 from writer Richard Matheson, and Burnt Offerings in 1976, starring Oliver Reed, Betty Davis and Karen Black, which also features the scariest chauffeur ever committed to celluloid. A year later, we would see the release of The Sentinel in 1977, starring an array of Hollywood heavyweights, but sadly directed by Michael Winner. And then the same year, Mia Farrow, with yet another cool hairdo, would move into a haunted London townhouse in the movie Full Circle. This is based on a Peter Straub book called The Haunting of Julia, and is a creepy little film, and if you've never seen it and you like a haunted house movie, I would suggest giving it a watch. And then in 1979, we of course had the Amityville Horror, the supposedly true story of the Lutz family and the horrors that they encountered after moving into a murder house. I know it's meant to be a classic of the genre, but I have to say it's really not one of my favourites, despite a great score and a very good performance from James Brolin and Margot Kidder, as well as some epic scenery chewing from Rod Steiger. And because I've not mentioned it for a couple of episodes, if you're interested in a British take on the Amityville Horror story, I highly recommend the episode The House That Bled to Death from the UK anthology series Hammer House of Horror. Anyone who saw it when it was first screened in 1980 on Saturday Night TV remembers it incredibly well, especially the birthday party sequence, and I'll say no more than that. All of which brings us up to 1980, and our second film in this week's double bill, which is The Changeling, directed by Peter Medak, and starring George C. Scott, Trish Vandeveer, and Melvin Douglas. And again, we are going to get into the spoilers relatively early with this one, so if you've yet to see The Changeling and don't want all of the secrets ruined for you, it's time to press pause. Listeners who have heard the episode about the French film Them will by now know how I feel about movies being marketed as based on true stories. And I have to say, it really wasn't until relatively recently that I discovered that The Changeling itself was one such film and was allegedly based on a true haunting. The story behind The Changeling was written by Russell Hunter, a writer, playwright and composer who claimed to have experienced a similar haunting as the one depicted in the movie. In the late 1960s, while working on a stage production in Denver, Colorado, Hunter rented a large building known as the Henry Treat Rogers Mansion. Once there, he claimed to experience strange disturbances, like doors opening on their own, banging and crashing that occurred every morning at 6 a.m, taps turning on by themselves, and vibrations through the walls. Hunter claimed that he and an architect friend eventually uncovered a hidden staircase in the back of a closet, and this led to the third floor of the home. There they found a child's trunk containing schoolbooks and a journal. The journal detailed the life of a young boy who was kept in isolation because he was disabled. Shortly after this discovery, Hunter held a séance, and if you've seen the movie, you know more or less what was revealed during that spiritualism session. Hunter eventually became so terrified that he left the mansion and would not return to it again until it was demolished to make way for an apartment building in 1970. Many of the quote-unquote facts of Hunter's story have been called into question, and it's been pointed out that the historical details in the tale that he told don't exactly check out. Personally, I am rather cynical, but nevertheless it is incredibly filmic, and it's not surprising that it was optioned for the screen, with the screenplay written by William Gray and Diana Maddox. The film was produced by a pair of Canadian exhibitors turned producers who were looking to take advantage of Canada's tax shelter boom. This was a wave of federal tax incentives that were introduced in the late 1970s, and this allowed investors to write off 100% of their contributions to film production. This initiative created a surge of movie financing, and many of them were horror or genre films that might otherwise have not been made. These include, of course, The Changeling, but also many of David Cronenberg's early movies, including Shivers, Rabid and The Brood, as well as the Jamie Lee Curtis slasher Prom Night from 1980, and the Jamie Lee Curtis slasher Terror Train, also from the same year. Other films include My Bloody Valentine from 1981, Happy Birthday to Me, also from 1981, and the absolutely terrible, but I just like saying the word, Humongous from 1982. Initially, though, the production struggled finding a director. Donald Cammell, who had co-directed one of my favourite non-horror movies, Performance, in 1970 with Nicholas Roeg, was originally attached to direct, but he left the project due to creative differences. Tony Richardson was also considered, but they finally struck lucky with their ultimate choice, Peter Medak. Peter Medak was born in Budapest on the 23rd of December 1937. He fled Hungary during the 1956 uprising and settled in England, where he began working as a trainee at Associated British Pathé, learning under established filmmakers like David Lean and Carol Reed. His feature debut came in 1968 with Negatives, and he gained international recognition with A Day in the Death of Joe Egg, which was released in 1972. But it was with the black comedy The Ruling Class, later in 1972, that he confirmed his reputation, and also earned himself a Palme d'Or nomination. Throughout the 1970s, he moved between Britain and Hollywood, working in both film and TV, and when he was offered The Changeling, he took it up because, he says, he read the script and it absolutely terrified him. He has said that the only other script that ever made him feel that way was the screenplay for Robert Wise's The Haunting, and he immediately knew how to make a good, frightening, psychological, and supernatural thriller out of it. However, he did have one or two issues with the story, saying that there were too many fantastical things in it that didn't make sense, and that he instead wanted to opt for more of a supernatural detective story that eliminated sensationalism in favour of building a slow and creeping sense of fear. He went on to say, quote, "I simplified it to make it more believable for me. It was a logic thing. One irons out things for one's own sake." End quote. And he's later expanded on this, saying that he wanted to make a film that was very psychological and that didn't have any cheap shocks in it. The finished film introduces us to John, played by George C. Scott, a composer who, at the very beginning of the film, can do nothing but look on helplessly as his wife and daughter are killed in a rather horrific roadside accident. Looking to recover and build a new life, he moves to Seattle, Washington, though in reality the film was mainly shot in and around Vancouver. Once there, he rents a long-deserted mansion from an organisation called the Historical Society. On his first morning, he is awakened early by a deafening and rhythmic banging that seems to reverberate throughout the entire house. More and more unusual events occur, and over time he becomes convinced that the house is in fact haunted. Working with a new friend and employee of the Historical Society, Claire Norman, John begins to investigate the house's past, leading him to cross paths with a corrupt senator, played by the legendary Hollywood star Melvin Douglas. It is implied in the movie that John's grief, and particularly the loss of his daughter, have made him more sensitive to the energies in the house, and this is why they are reaching out to him for help. And much like The Uninvited, the fact that he is a composer is also an indicator of sensitivity and openness to atmosphere. As we discussed earlier, this also allows for numerous scenes composing at the piano, but here it also moves the plot forward and provides evidence of the haunting. John believes he is composing an original piece of music, something that Claire refers to as sounding like a lullaby. But he soon discovers that it is not an original piece at all, but is the tune that is played in a music box he finds hidden in the barricaded attic. And of course, his being a composer also provides a reason for a piano to be in the house at all, without which we would not get the, admittedly now slightly cliched, pressing down of a piano key in an abandoned room. Working with cinematographer John Coquillon, production designer Trevor Williams, and Elia Lilia Pedersen, Medak creates some arresting moments throughout the film, perhaps most famously a ball bouncing down the stairs when it should still be at the bottom of a river. But there's also an incredibly tense seance that I personally believe was direct inspiration for the one in Insidious from 2010, nightmarish images of a drowning child, and my particular favourite moment, a whirling race with the camera through the house as the spirit of Joseph reveals how he came to die. Medak also uses a lot of high-angle shots to represent Joseph's point of view, something that is also depicted through the floating camera that creeps down the attic stairs during the séance. But for my money, what really makes the movie effective is the sound design, from the deafening banging sounds that wake John up every morning, the amplified dripping of taps, and the whispers found on the tape recording of the aforementioned séance. This is a movie that uses sound superbly to build fear and tension, and in the director's commentary on the Second Sight Blu-ray release, Medak describes his approach to horror by saying, quote, There's nothing more creepy than being in a huge building and hearing the faintest little noise. The wonderful thing about ghosts is that you don't see them right in your face. You see it in your peripheral vision, at the back of your head, and then you turn around and you just see a curtain slightly moving. And that's scarier than anything else. And that's what I was trying to do with the movie. Of course, for any haunted house movie, you need a haunted house. And in this case, it was all an illusion, as the team could not find a house with the right gothic presence, and so built the exterior facade in South Vancouver and then set it alight for the climax. The interiors of the house were all studio sets but built on one soundstage, costing $500,000. The end result, though, is a magnificent presence in the movie, almost acting as a character in and of itself, with its cavernous rooms, multiple staircases, and swinging chandeliers. The introduction of a corrupt senator and the Washington setting places the Changeling in a rather curious Venn diagram between ghost story and political conspiracy thriller, a genre that dominated the 1970s box office. Given that the film began shooting in 1979, we can quite easily see it as an extension of the paranoid and conspiracy themes of films like The Parallax View and The Conversation, both from 1974, and All the President's Men from 1976. Indeed, Stephen King would later go on to describe The Changeling as being a strange combination of ghosts and Watergate. And of course, what would any paranoid conspiracy thriller be without a no-nonsense everyman hero, someone who digs through the archives and institutional records, and who will stop at nothing to get to the truth? And in this case, he is played by George C. Scott. George C. Scott was born in 1927 in Virginia and was the younger of two children. At the age of 18, he began service in the US Marine Corps, which lasted from 1945 to 1949. After his service, he studied journalism at the University of Missouri, where he also discovered a passion for drama. After graduating, he found success in theatre, most notably with the New York Shakespeare Festival in 1957, where his performance in Richard III caught the attention of critics. At the same time, he was beginning to appear on TV and in movies, and made his big screen debut in 1958 in the film The Hanging Tree. In 1959, he appeared opposite James Stewart in Otto Preminger's Anatomy of a Murder, for which he received an Oscar nomination at the age of 32. However, when he was nominated again in 1961 for Best Supporting Actor for his role opposite Paul Newman in the film The Hustler, he wrote to the Academy and asked that his name be withdrawn from consideration, arguing that acting performances shouldn't be judged competitively. The Academy ignored his request and kept him on the ballot, but ultimately that year he didn't win, as the award went to George Chakiris from West Side Story. Scott repeated the refusal again in 1970 when he actually won the Best Actor Oscar for his performance in the movie Patton. To be fair, he had sent a telegram to the Academy beforehand saying that he would refuse any award, and so they really can't have been that surprised when he didn't attend the ceremony and the statue went unclaimed. The award itself was finally sent to him, only for it to be returned, making him the first actor to refuse an Oscar. He clearly had a very dim view of the Academy Awards and referred to it as, quote, a 2-hour meat parade, a public display with contrived suspense for economic reasons. They are offensive, barbarous, and innately corrupt. End quote. Across his career, George C. Scott appeared in more than 60 feature films and over 30 TV productions, and despite his refusals of Academy Awards, he was nevertheless nominated and won numerous honours, including Golden Globes, Primetime Emmys, and Tony Awards. His best-known films include Anatomy of Murder from 1959, The Hustler from 1961, Dr. Strangelove from 1964, Patton from 1970, Hardcore in 1979, and I would also say The Changeling from 1980. But in the 1980s, his health began to deteriorate. A heavy drinker and a heavy smoker, he suffered a series of heart attacks between 1982 and 1987, which left him weakened but still determined to keep working. Though increasingly frail, he continued to take on film and TV roles, including a performance in A Christmas Carol in 1984 and the television remake of 12 Angry Men in 1997, for which he won an Emmy. But by the late 1990s, his condition had worsened, and in September 1999, he died of an aneurysm at his home in California. He was 71 years old. In the director's commentary on the recent Blu-ray release from Second Sight Films, Medak describes Scott as the most incredible actor he worked with, a monumental man with an enormous personality. Though he also admits to initially being somewhat afraid of him due to his reputation of being difficult. Medak says that this is something that he didn't experience at all himself on the film, particularly after the two started working together and Scott started viewing the dailies. In The Changeling, Scott is joined by his real-life wife, Trish Vandeveer, who plays Claire Norman. Watching it again most recently, I was struck by how rare it now feels to see a major film, and especially a horror film, anchored by two middle-aged protagonists, when in contemporary horror, leads are more typically young and pretty much interchangeable. Scott and Vandeveer bring experienced and almost lived-in performances that make the grief, doubt, and rage at the heart of the film feel all the more convincing. And in a world where actors are now cast based on their social media following, it feels like something that we've largely lost, and that feels like a real shame. And of course they are joined by an even more mature figure in the form of Melvin Douglas, who plays Senator Joseph Carmichael, the changeling of the title. Douglas first came to fame in the 1930s as a suave and sophisticated leading man opposite some of the biggest actresses of the day, beginning with his first credited screen appearance in the film Tonight or Never in 1931. He starred alongside Greta Garbo in Ninotchka in 1939, Joan Crawford in A Woman's Face in 1941, and Katharine Hepburn in Woman of the Year in 1942. Unlike some of his contemporaries, he managed to transition smoothly from romantic lead to respected character actor, and the 1960s and 1970s brought some of his most acclaimed performances. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for HUD in 1963 opposite Paul Newman, and again for Being There in 1979 opposite Peter Sellers. Alongside these, he also earned multiple Golden Globe Awards and was widely admired for his consistency and versatility as a performer. By the time of The Changeling, he was in his late 70s, but still a very commanding screen presence, and he had just finished working on Roman Polanski's The Tenant. His portrayal of Senator Carmichael carries both dignity and menace, but there is a real pathos there too, as the senator, who, after all, was not complicit in the crimes of the past, has to face the truth. The confrontation with Scott is a masterclass in acting from two Hollywood legends, and the range of emotions that Douglas displays in the final 20 minutes is a testament to his talent. Medak recalls him as being an absolute joy to work with and a wonderful actor and person. Fittingly, his last film was another haunted house picture, which was Ghost Story in 1981, where he joined fellow veterans Fred Astaire, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and John Houseman in a story of elderly men confronting past sins and supernatural revenge. The past sin at the heart of this story is, of course, the murder of the disabled child Joseph and his replacement with a boy taken from a nearby orphanage. This act of cold-blooded and financially driven parental cruelty is placed in stark contrast with the character of John. We have one father on one side murdering his son to protect wealth and legacy, whilst on the other side we have one who was left broken by the sudden loss of his daughter, and who would do absolutely anything to get her back. And just to emphasise the commentary on parent-child relationships, when John and Claire continue their investigation into the haunting, they are led to a house in the suburbs where they meet a widowed mother raising a young daughter. Families and the things that keep them together or pull them apart is a recurring theme here, even below the surface. Medak has said that when he was a child he had a brother who died and that his presence followed him through his life. When taking on the movie, he decided to honour him, and his name is mentioned in the screenplay several times, so the theme of family loss is here subliminally as well. The fact that the ghost is a child also dictates the spirit's behaviour, with the manifestations of the haunting the acts of an out-of-control infant, with one spiritual tantrum in particular causing Scott to shout out, "You son of a bitch, what do you want from me? I've done everything I can." On its release in 1980, the film received a somewhat mixed critical reception, with some calling it superior and comparing it favourably to The Innocents, and others calling it somewhat unexceptional. While most praised its polish and technical execution, some felt that it was a little too mannered and lacked any real sense of danger, particularly in relation to the fate of George C. Scott, who, they said, the viewers never believed to be in real peril. Others still were somewhat critical of the mystery plot, with one critic noting that, quote, "the leaps made by Scott's agile mind in identifying both victims and usurper leave logic and credence at the starting block." End quote. Despite this, at the 1980 Genie Awards, which were later renamed the Canadian Screen Awards, The Changeling swept most of the top categories, including motion picture, performance by a foreign actor or actress for Scott and Vandeveer respectively, cinematography, art direction, production design, sound editing, and adapted screenplay. The Changeling, which was produced for around $6.5 million, fared solidly at the box office and went on to gross approximately $12 million during its theatrical run, and this was almost entirely from Canada and the USA, with international takings barely recorded beyond later limited re-releases. Over time, it has gone on to be seen as a minor classic of the genre, and frequently sits alongside The Haunting and The Innocents as an effective and mood-driven ghost story. Guillermo del Toro told Medak that he thought The Changeling was a masterpiece, and Martin Scorsese has placed it on his list of the 11 scariest horror films of all time. Peter Medak, quite naturally, immediately followed this moody and grief-haunted ghost story with the parody Zorro the Gay Blade in 1981, and then in the 1990s turned to a couple of true crime dramas, including The Craze in 1990 and Let Him Have It in 1991. He also directed the 1993 neo-noir Romeo is Bleeding, starring Gary Oldman, Lena Olin and Juliette Lewis, and then became a sought-after TV director, contributing to series including The Wire, Hannibal and Homicide: Life on the Street. His later career has been defined both by retrospectives of earlier work and by the self-reflective documentary The Ghost of Peter Sellers from 2020, which revisited a very troubled 1973 production that had haunted him for decades. This was the unreleased film Ghost in the Noonday Sun, which starred Peter Sellers, and on which he was apparently incredibly difficult to say the least, demonstrating increasingly erratic behaviour on set, including tantrums, late arrivals, feigning illness, refusing to act with his co-stars, and indeed refusing to speak to Peter Medak, his director. The resultant film was so bad that it was never released, and the whole thing nearly ruined Medak's career. He later said of the experience, and of Sellers, quote, "He destroyed the whole film. As an artist, he was a genius. As a person, he was insane." End quote. So I'm happy to say that he seemed to fare much better on this picture. The Uninvited and The Changeling are of course both examples of the classic haunted house, and feature many of the same tropes. As I mentioned at the beginning, both are also mystery stories, with Rick and Pamela gradually uncovering the truth about Stella's parentage, and John and Claire literally digging up the past to reveal the murder of the child Joseph. In this sense, they both follow the dual structure of detective fiction, one narrative tracing the crime that happened in the past, and another following the investigation in the present. Both can also be viewed as critiques of the family unit, with Joseph murdered and replaced in order to secure an inheritance, and Stella taken from her birth mother and passed off as another woman's child. Family secrets are, of course, now a staple of the haunted house movie, and the haunted house movie is now, of course, a staple of the horror genre, and it's hard to believe that it only really established itself as late as 1944 with The Uninvited. In the same year as The Changeling, we also saw the release of The Shining, though some will argue that that's not a haunted house film at all. In 1982, Steven Spielberg and Tobe Hooper gave us Poltergeist, and in the very same year, we also had the first of a seemingly never-ending cycle of Amityville sequels beginning with Amityville 2, The Possession. Since then, we've seen any number of haunted houses, including The Others, starring Nicole Kidman in 2001, The Devil's Backbone from Guillermo del Toro in the same year, and The Orphanage in 2007, to name just 3 of my favourites. All of which, to be fair, have more than a few things in common with this week's 2 movies. And were I to even attempt to list even a third of some of the haunted houses and hotels that we've seen in the ensuing years, we would indeed be here for days. So suffice it to say that despite having a rather late start, the subgenre really isn't going anywhere anytime soon. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please do take a moment to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's films, or indeed any of the films that we've discussed in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow the show on Instagram at thehorrordouble for photos, behind-the-scenes news, trailers and other bits and pieces. So next week we are going to explore the horrors of artificial intelligence. First up, we have Colossus, the Forbin project from 1970, directed by Joseph Sargent and starring Eric Braeden, Susan Clark and Gordon Pinsett. Then we are going to jump forward to 2018 and Upgrade from director Lee Whannell, starring Logan Marshall Green, Harrison Gilbertson and Betty Gabriel. If you want to watch along, there is, as of the time of recording, only one place that you can watch Colossus, the Forbin project, unless you happen to have a DVD. And that is on the Internet Archive. So, if you want to watch it, go online and search for Colossus, the Forbin project at the Internet Archive. And, as of the time of recording, and if you're in the UK, you can currently watch Upgrade on Amazon Prime, YouTube, Google Play Movies and Apple TV. So I'll be back next week for the discussion, and until then, thank you so much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.